So what this is really all about is adapting to changing context in our country and in our world. It's about thinking about how do we move beyond the traditional models of how we've worked in the past. It's about expanding our capacity for impact, the ability to reach more young people in new and dynamic ways, and always remembering that we've got to put learning right at the heart of all that we do. Welcome to this new series, which is about creating effective learning resources. And in this session, we're going to be looking at independent remote learning. So for this session, there's a couple of things you need to do before we start. First of all, get yourself a drink, either a cup of tea or a nice glass of water just to get your brain flowing. And you're going to need your worksheet. So have a printed copy of the worksheet out next to you with a pen so you can fill it in as we go. But most importantly, are you ready to learn? So have you switched off your email, got your social media turned off, and put yourself in a position where you're actually ready to learn and good to go? So in this session, we're going to look at the basics of remote learning, and then we'll move on in a future sessions to look at how we structure learning resources, how to use design to actually aid and help students learn. And then lastly, we'll look at making effective videos to skyrocket students' learning. When we're thinking about the basics of remote learning and independent learning, we'll be looking at all different types of remote learning that have been going on over the last year, the differences in those learning styles. We'll focus a little bit on how to relearn about learning. So what are the actual cornerstones of what we've really got to understand about education to help us in any type of resource creation. We'll look at the remote learning mantra, which realistically could be the learning mantra, how to make learning accessible, and then the best way you can share that resource with others. So it's important to think a little bit about the world that we're living in right now. And there's so many people asking questions, is our education system fit for a modern world? They were asking it before the pandemic, and obviously great questions have been asked even more so now. This worldwide disruption that we've lived in has left an urgent need to respond. And I think it's important to understand that there are no experts. This is still early days. We're all fellow travelers on this journey, and certainly us as creating this resource, we're not claiming to be an expert in any way, shape or form. We're just trying to bring together some of the learning that's been happening over the last year. There's massive concern about young people and their well-being. We've got tech poverty and inequality happening. The argument between do students need to catch up or don't they? Where do we start? There's attendance and monitoring and concerns about the lost young people and all the well-being needs that comes and brings with it. There's also the fact that in this steep learning curve that most people have never taught remotely before, it's a bit of a great experiment. It's also an opportunity to learn new skills, to coordinate and collaborate and communicate in new ways. It's important to give ourselves a bit of a break and realize that we're not going to get it right first time. But what a brilliant phrase, brilliance over time. That's what we're going for, brilliance over time. In the future, we're going to be able to use what we've learned in new and exciting ways that we probably don't even fully understand yet. So that's why we're trying to focus on where we are now so that we can build and impact young people in the future. So if we start by looking back at what's been going on over the last year when the school closures have happened and how across the nation and the world we've had to develop lots of different types of remote learning. So let's just look at basically what the 4 different types of remote learning are, because I think that if we concentrate on remote learning as a foundation, it actually really will help us in all of the different types of learning, because it really does make you think in a different way. So we've got synchronous, that is real-time online live lessons that are happening around the country right now. So students are logging on to lessons as if they were in the classroom with a live teacher, just done digitally. There's asynchronous, that is pre-prepared resources for independent learning in students' own time. And that's what a lot of what we're going to focus on in these sessions to actually how we create them, because they really help us in the bigger picture. Then, of course, there's blended learning. So there's the idea of being in a classroom for a bit and then being at home. Already happened in some cases, may happen in the future due to future disruption because of the pandemic or other things that come about. And then there's non-digital resources. So basically, obviously, when we're talking about remote learning, we're not just talking about logging onto a computer. There's reading, workbooks, worksheets, all those kind of traditional methods of how people learn before the internet even existed. And it's bringing all those together that makes up this menu of remote learning. What experts have found over the last year is that there's no one best method of doing this. There's no kind of silver bullet when it comes to remote learning. And in fact, variety is a key to success. Combining things are possible, and certainly this is the way I think the future is going to go, is in terms of being able to use different methods of learning and execute them in different ways depending on your context and your needs. So combinations are possible, and in fact some of the better examples of good practice have been where there's been combinations. So you've had real-time live lessons happening mixed in with some pre-recorded elements. There's been that link between what's going on at home and the classroom, and teachers have been really thinking about how they execute lessons in new and dynamic ways. You can see from the quote from Teacher School Kit that the evidence really leans towards not necessarily what the medium is, but actually the quality of implementation. So how well does a school actually build a culture and a system around learning, which is the same as if the schools are open, really. So school expectations really, really matter when it comes to success in this whole area. So as I said, there's not necessarily one best way of doing this, but there are some differences in the approaches. So synchronous real-time learning, what teachers have found, and this is from research done by some of the big unions and just from the government themselves, is that it's actually been quite good for classroom engagement. You can get dynamic interactive learning happening in an online fashion. The depth of teaching and feedback is much stronger when it's live, when you've got your teacher that you know there with you. And it's also quite good for the well-being of the students in terms of them being able to see their friends in real time, and also for the teacher just to be able to check up on them when they need to make sure that they're okay. It's that kind of safe and well check in a kind of online forum. What's not so good about it is it requires rigid scheduling. There's huge technical difficulties, and of course you can add to that tech poverty in terms of disparity of people who've got access to equipment, and the idea of some young people being stuck sharing a smartphone between a whole family of students really doesn't lean itself nicely to this idea of real-time synchronous education. There's also a confidence to engage issue. So they've found in some places that students have struggled to engage because, interestingly, as much as they kind of have lived their world out on a screen, it's actually a different dynamic to be on a sort of a video call and have your face shown and be able to participate in lessons online. It's a bit of a new skill to learn. And there's also been huge fatigue, extra tiredness due to being on, they call it Zoom fatigue, don't they? Zoom drain, actually being on that screen for so long. So asynchronous learning then happens in your own time. And what's really good about this is there's a flexibility of schedule. You can basically do it when you want. Of course, you've got to want to do it. There's an individualized pace, which particularly with students with additional needs, this can be really helpful because you're not trying to keep up with everybody else in your class. You can actually take it at your own pace. You can pause, rewind, go back, take longer where you need. So it's fantastic for that. There's less tech barriers because it doesn't require necessarily that constant stream of internet access. You can sort of download things or come back to it at a different time. And what's really good as well is you can impact more students. So when you start to think about creating resources that can go everywhere, you start to remove the limits of having one teacher in one classroom, and that gets quite exciting. The downside of all this is that there has been a greater sense of isolation for students. Motivation's not always brilliant. Again, imagine and think about the fact that you're on your own in your house. Why bother? Why do I actually need to learn? Split attention is a bit of an issue. So, you might be feeling like you're doing one thing, but actually you've got 100 different things going on. And that's why it's so important to prepare yourself and get yourself ready to learn. And there's a massive lack of feedback loop, which means that if you've got a problem or if you don't understand something, it can be a lot harder when you're doing remote learning resources to actually get that feedback from a staff member or a teacher, and sometimes it doesn't come at all. We need to start to think differently about how our resources that we create might be used. So could this be something that's remote learning at home with a student directly? Is it going to be something that's delivered by somebody other than the person that made it? So what needs to change accordingly? How could this be adapted for classroom teaching and blend in different elements of what we pre-recorded or created in advance? And the same for live online teaching too. All of this idea of how we actually approach the delivery mechanism of our learning resources impacts how we create it in the first place. And as much as possible, we need to think flexibly for the future. When we start to think about creating any learning resource, we of course need to think about learning. That's the heart of what this is all about. In the New Ofsted Handbook, they define learning as an alteration in long-term memory. So progress means knowing more and remembering more. In other words, what are they going to remember after they've enjoyed the lesson, after they've learned it in that kind of initial moment? What's going to stick over time? So therefore, making learning sticky has to be at the heart of when we think about creating resources. What are the best ways to make learning stick then? We're going to do a short learning task now where I want you to watch the video on the next screen. And it's a video that just gives you some really quick fire ways to make learning stick. And then just for fun, after a minute, how many of those can you still recall out loud? If you are interested in knowing how that last video was made, it was simply a PowerPoint exported as a video with the timings on it. And then I brought it into a package called InShot, which we'll learn about in a later session, added the music and the emojis just to liven it up a little bit. So thinking about what makes learning stick is really important. It involves addressing motivations as to why students should bother. It's about breaking it up into small chunks over time. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Giving opportunities to actually put what they're learning into practice so that it will try to stick in their long-term memory. Above all, it's about remembering that if humans are naturally going to forget more than 70% of what they learn within 24 hours, we really do need to think about what we want to stick. Let's take a couple of minutes to look at the remote learning mantra. And this is a set of principles that could be applied to any type of learning. When it comes to creating digital resources, we need to keep it simple, keep it structured, keep it sticky, and keep it safe. And of course, you note the use of alliteration there to help you remember it. Keep it simple. There should be a clear learning outcome that's not too complex and not too many things trying to be fit into any one session. There needs to be a clear purpose so that people know where it fits, and a simple format that doesn't require loads of explanation and loads of different types of files and things to download. Has to be flexible enough to fit into normal school systems, and we need to eliminate assumption through what we're doing and supplying. Keep it structured. We'll look at this in depth in the next session, but there should be a clear flow of learning that links to a bigger picture. Students will disengage and withdraw if they struggle to digest new complex concepts. So how you structure it really matters. A variety of activities to engage with, not too samey, and appealing to all different types of learners really helps. The balance of input versus output matters. So not all teacher-led. Give the students something to do. Ensuring pupils receive clear explanations and expectations will help walk them through the learning. Scaffolding it right supports growth in confidence and actually gives them the chance to apply new knowledge and new skills. Above all else, we should be asking the question, is this moving learning on? Keeping it sticky. We've already looked at this, but there's a shift from just learning it or enjoying it to actually remembering it. And one of the best ways we can do this is think about from the young person's perspective. Put yourself in young person's shoes and think about their starting point and where they're going to be learning from, and help learning stick from there. When it comes to teaching versus learning, we've got to think about what am I teaching, but more important, what are they remembering? And lastly, keep it safe. All types of education, whether remote or otherwise, should always operate in line with keeping children safe in education and full safeguarding principles. We should be choosing topics that are age appropriate and think about, would we normally teach this offline in the classroom if it's online? Topics that are remote learning appropriate that could pose a risk need to be considered carefully. There's a lot of debate around this. Sometimes when it comes to risk, we've got to think about the context of the community. And for example, is there an incident that promotes a response? Is there something that actually not teaching this material would cause a greater risk in the long term? These things need to be carefully thought through by school communities. We should be using media that's appropriate if we're doing remote learning. Avoid key terms or references that might send people down a rabbit hole without explanation. We have to manage unhealthy curiosity. We want to create curiosity, but not one that can't be guided in the right direction. If you are presenting yourself on camera and audio, think about minimizing personal information. Think about, can you actually identify where we live, or is it just an inappropriate space for filming? When you're thinking about signposting, we always need to include calls to action for students to get extra support if they need. So don't leave young people in the lurch. Consider being GDPR compliant. So basically this means not collecting unnecessary data. If you're doing a survey or something from a student, has it got any data that you don't need in there? If so, you've probably got to think carefully about how you collect it. There should be appropriate caveats and warnings around any type of learning and any type of call to action, such as internet usage. Don't assume. Above all, if you wouldn't do it in a live classroom, you probably shouldn't do it remotely. That's how we keep students safe. So keep it simple, keep it structured, keep it sticky, keep it safe. That's the remote learning mantra. Here's an opportunity for you to put this learning into practice. So we're going to pause the video in a moment and turn to our worksheet. I want you to think about a remote learning resource that you've either created yourself or used recently. Think about it. If you've got it to hand, get it out ready, have a look at it. But I want you to make a list of the pros and cons of that resource when you consider it and compare it against the remote learning mantra. So ask yourself questions like, is this simple? Is it structured? Is it sticky? And is it safe? After you've done that, it will really move your learning forward in terms of thinking about how you create resources in the future and maybe how you amend some that you've already got. You're going to resume the video after 10 minutes and we'll see you in a few minutes. One of the biggest challenges of this last period of remote learning and school disruption has been, how do we make learning accessible for all types of learners? For many SEN students, they've found this a really difficult time. So the lack of adult support and social interactions has been really hard for them. Others have actually found it a place for them to thrive. Remote learning from home has meant they can work at their own pace, there's less sensory overload, and actually the minimized social interactions really mean they can focus. These two stark differences remind us that, as it says in this webinar, which I watched recently, fantastic webinar, there's no generic approach to remote learning for SEN because there's no generic SEN child. So how do we actually make our resources as accessible for all types of learners? There are a few things to think about. Remember, when it comes to remote learning resources, particularly video or audio, you are the adult in the room. So the way you come across as a friendly face or have that clear communication and approachable tone really matters and makes a difference. Any instructions should be simple, clear, any difficult words explained, and the clearer and simpler the visuals, the better. How you package and communicate about the resource is important. So if it is being used by another teacher to be watched or engaged with by an SEN student, you need to encourage staff to watch in advance and give time for that as well. Resources may need to be available in flexible formats so they can be adapted by specialist staff who are working with specific children. That helps us make our resources more available for all types of learners. At the start of the school closures, there was a lot of talk about what is the best tool to use to actually make your digital resources. Well, as the conversations move on, people have realized that basically it's any creation tool that suits you best. So what is it you feel most comfortable working with, and what simply allows you to focus on learning and not just go crazy with technology? We should be thinking about learning tools that can be exported to any flexible format, especially if we're actually using our resources across multiple schools who use different platforms. There's no best platform except the one that can be exported to any platform. If you want to learn more about specific digital platforms, you can go online. There's loads of learning resources. You can learn about PowerPoint or Loom or Google Classroom or Teams or Google Slides. There's so much out there, so this is not the place to go into that in detail here. There's how-tos and frequently asked questions for all these resources. Try them out. When you're creating activities and resources, it's probably important to think about they might be used in different types of platforms. So therefore, minimizing things like transitions and animations that might mess up in conversion really helps. There is so much content out there available for people now, so establishing clear expectations and guidelines around how content might be used is vital to ensuring it's successful. So if you've got a video, a PowerPoint, a document or a resource that you want to be embedded into children's learning, expectations matter. So talking through with the right people how it's going to be used, when it's going to be used, what expectation of feedback is there from the student is important. Does the student have to produce something which is then going to be marked and fed back at a later date? How are all these resources going to be used together and communicated in such a simple way for people to be able to understand and get on with learning? The goal of successfully sharing our resources is all about eliminating assumption. So what information do you need to provide for key stakeholders in what format? So what do we need to provide for the student? What's the best way for the student to access this learning? What about the teacher? What does a teacher need to know if they're going to deliver that resource or even pass that on third hand to the student? Is there any information for parents? Do we need to communicate with them in some way about this? Is it a topic which maybe they need to know more about? Above all, we're eliminating assumption and we're thinking through carefully how we handhold people so that we can walk them through to a place of learning and remembering. Let's think about what we need to remember from today. So we've looked at the different types of remote learning and really covered the differences between real-time learning and learning at your own pace. There's some advantages and disadvantages of those styles. There's no one best way of doing things, but when it comes to our resource creation, we've got to be thinking as flexibly as possible and really putting learning at the heart of what we do. As we think about relearning about learning, we need to remember that the art of remembering has to be at the heart of any resource creation. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to really help learning stick, we've got to remember the remote learning mantra, which is keep it simple, keep it structured, keep it sticky, and keep it safe. As we do this, we can start to consider how we can make our resources accessible for all types of learners, remembering that the simpler the better, and remembering that the more flexible we can in that resource, be in that resource creation, the better it's going to be for the end user. As we're sharing our resource with others, we've got to think about how we communicate what really matters in order to help that learning take place. Next time, we're going to look at how we structure our learning resources in more depth. That brings us towards the end of our lesson on basically creating effective learning resources from scratch. If you want to find out more, you can check out school policies, see some great examples on Oak National Academy online. The Teacher Toolkit is a blog where people share ideas and hints and tips about this stuff all the time. The Department for Education is regularly producing research and guidance on the matter. All the different unions are tackling this subject right now, and people like the PSHE Association can give you further guidance and some great examples of good practice. If you want to share some feedback and take the short online survey after this lesson, all you've got to do is take your smartphone, open the camera and scan the QR code, and it will link you straight to a survey where you can tell us what you think. And we'll see you next time online.